Okay.
Recording started.
So I'd like to welcome you all to our second synchronous moment that we've had for CRST 290. We are now starting to have these kinds of webinars every term so we can give students an opportunity to attend a live session with a professor and review the material or topics that are related to the course. So previously, a few terms ago, we held a webinar that was devoted to reviewing difficult material from the course. And later this week, we're going to send out a link of the recording for that to all of the Creation Studies students. So you'll receive that later this week. And in addition, at the end of this webinar, if you guys have any questions about the course material or about what's discussed tonight that you want to discuss with Dr. DeWitt, we can address those at the end. So tonight we're going to be discussing creation arguments that people use, but they really shouldn't. And we decided to have a session on this topic because in our creation studies sections on the discussion boards and in the interview paper at the end of the course, we see a large number of arguments that are used by students that sound good, but they're either outdated or they're based on faulty logic or they're misused. And so we've compiled a list of common arguments or misconceptions that are used for creation arguments that really don't work in hopes of clearing up any confusion that you or other students might have. So as I said, if you have any questions during the webinar tonight, you can send them to me using the chat function in WebEx, and I will see them. You won't be able to speak, but I can see them, and if they're related to what Dr. DeWitt's talking about, then I will bring them up during when he's speaking, or at the end, if they're related to the course materials, we'll try and cover them at the end. And if for some reason that we don't get to your question, then we'll make sure that you get an answer after the session. So Dr. DeWitt, we're glad that you could meet with us tonight to discuss this important topic, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. This is a very useful discussion for us to have, and in particular, when people use arguments that are evidences that are outdated or inappropriate, two things can happen. One is if people actually know more information about it, then the person who's using the outdated or faulty information will look foolish and silly, and that's not a good testimony for a Christian. The second thing that can happen is if someone is putting a lot of stock and faith in something that turns out to be wrong or that they later find out is wrong, then it can have a negative or even devastating effect on people. So we want to always make sure that we're using current and accurate information whenever we're talking about any subject, but especially origins. We just have, well, there is a lot of bad information that floats around. You see, we get emails, right, from things that are not true or not valid, and you have to check them out. So I want to preface this because what we're covering tonight, we're not going to be covering everything, but it's important for people to have solid, trustworthy sources that they can go to for information. And so the top two, first, Answers in Genesis. Their website, answersingenesis.org. They will have up-to-date, current, accurate information. And importantly, and the other organization, I'm sorry, is ICR, Institute for Creation Research, and their website is icr.org. Now, why I recommend these two in particular is because they vet the information. So that anything that gets posted to their website is going to have been reviewed by experts. And for example, I will, from time to time, I will get articles related to molecular biology or human origin. I'll get articles to review to make sure that it's accurate. Dr. Ross gets articles to review on fossils and geology. And so you want to make sure that where you're getting the information from is going to have that kind of checking done. Well, of course, people make mistakes, but in some cases, there are individuals that are off doing their own thing, and if they don't have people checking up on what they're doing, then they'll be more likely to make a mistake. And so the Answers in Genesis and ICR are the best places for accurate, up-to-date information. So the first argument that people use that they shouldn't is the second law of thermodynamics, and that it started after the fall. This was popular quite a while back, but the second law of thermodynamics explains a lot of very critical things, like breathing. The air that we exhale from our lungs, that is being driven out by the second law of thermodynamics. It also applies to the digestion of food, and the second law of thermodynamics is just how entropy increases in a spontaneous process. That's the technical way to put it. So randomness is going to increase. That's the driving force for chemical and physical reactions. And it's not something that happened or came about after the fall. Now, I do think God, prior to the fall, was intervening in creation more than we see today. And what I mean by that is when we look at Scripture, always see what's in the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fiery furnace. They survived, and their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. Well, now this is, by all measure, it would be a violation of the second law of thermodynamics, and it is because God intervened. Also, we see in the plagues of Egypt things that are kind of obviously out of the ordinary. But after the Israelites left Egypt, they marched through the desert, and their clothes didn't wear out. Well, that would be violating the second law of thermodynamics. So God intervened to protect that. So the second law of thermodynamics is not something that started at the fall. It would have been before the fall, but there are ways that God probably was intervening ahead of the fall. It's a complicated discussion as well, and people so frequently misuse the second law of thermodynamics that while there are ways that it can be used, it's so often messed up that it's better for Christians just to kind of leave it alone unless they really, really, really know what they're talking about.
So you're saying that we shouldn't say the earth is wearing down, therefore the second law of thermodynamics causes it all to happen.
Yeah, it's not that it started at the fall. It didn't start at the fall. And yes, everything's wearing out, but it's part of the creation that God made now. The second law won't apply at all when we have the new heavens and the new earth, because nothing wears out then. And I think that's part of what people get confused about, that the earth, when God made it, it was not an infinite, it wasn't that this was never going to have anything random, or it just, heaven is different from Eden, and that's where we get messed up. That makes sense?
I think that makes sense. I think that's really clear.
The next one, if humans evolved from apes, then why do apes still exist today? This one always initially seems like it's clever, except if you say this to an evolutionist, they will turn around and say that you're ignorant. And the problem is this. According to evolution, humans did not come from apes or did not replace apes. Humans and apes share a common ancestor. And so this argument would essentially be like, since you and your sibling have the same ancestor, right, you would say, oh, well, since you're here, why is your dad around? So it's misrepresenting in a very clear way what evolution is teaching. And even whether evolution is true or not, it would not follow that two species that were having a common, or two things with a common ancestor, one doesn't replace the other.
I think another question that's kind of related to this that I hear a lot is, if humans evolved from apes, then why don't we see apes turning into humans today? Would that have the same reply? Or is that the same reason we shouldn't use that, because they both have the common ancestor according to evolutionists?
Yeah, so according to evolution, they have a common ancestor, and it doesn't mean that anything, like all apes are on the progress to becoming human. That's why sometimes evolutionists will make this argument that if you rewound the evolutionary clock back millions of years, that it might turn out differently, and it wouldn't be humans, it would be giraffes that developed intelligence and became dominant on the planet. So it's because it so badly misrepresents what evolutionists say, it comes across as ignorant.
A question that one of our students asked was, did evolutionists at one time actually claim that we came from apes, or has it always been that we came from a similar ancestor, and this is just a misconception that we have in the way that we think about it?
Yeah, it's a popular misconception, and not just among Christians even, but lay people that don't pay much attention to evolution, they'll make the same mistake. Evolution from the time of Darwin, it has always been a branching tree. And so when you have a branching tree, just because you have one branch, you don't lose the other branches. And just because you have this branch going that way doesn't mean that they're all going to go that way.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So this one, no new species have been produced. This one is wrong because of the word species. And now, first off, species is a man-made construct. It is what we use to classify organisms and distinguish one organism from another. But it's not an actual thing, in the sense that it's what people have defined as a species. And in terms of biological definitions, species is a very fuzzy, it's a very poorly defined biological term, actually. But in general understanding, species is a group of organisms that that reproduce with that group. Now, since we have a lot of organisms like bacteria and amoebas that don't mate to reproduce, that's part of why species is kind of a difficult term to define biologically. Now, if we wanted to use this the right way, we wouldn't say no new species have been produced. We would say no new kinds, because there are new species as we define species. There are examples of new, not new, there are examples of groups of organisms that no longer can interbreed with the ancestral group. And in that case, by biological definition, that would be a new species. But it's not a new kind because it's still from the same original group that God made. So we would say no new kinds, but not no new species, because there have been new species.
So you're saying if we bred some new kind of dog that couldn't interbreed with other dogs, then that would be a new species, but it wouldn't. But it still is a dog, so it still is the same kind.
Right.
In theory.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, it's very fuzzy because you can breed a donkey and a horse, or a donkey and a zebra, or a zebra and a horse. And we've given these distinct species, we'll call them a different species, but they're really the same kind. And so that it complicates the use of it, because species and kind are sometimes used interchangeably when they're actually very different. So like coyotes or foxes would be different from our dog species, but they're part of the same kind, and actually they can interbreed.
So I think really the main argument that people are trying to make, but that they're using the technology to make, is that no new information has been introduced to make a new kind of animal. They're just becoming more, they can only become more specific and lose genetic material or lose genetic information, which would isolate them from other groups, but they're not becoming something new.
Right. Well, not a new kind.
Right.
Yeah, they're getting more specific. It might be a new species, but it may or may not be able to interbreed. But we're not getting something brand new.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's clear.
Okay. Natural selection does not occur, or natural selection equals evolution. Now, natural selection can occur, but most all of our examples are things where we're talking about chemical resistance or disease resistance, things of that nature. There are a lot of issues related to natural selection in that it doesn't have the power that people ascribe to it, because a lot of it's like just about any trait, oh, well, we can just select for that. Or I've even, usually it's like a middle school student, they like think that the X-Men like could be a real mutation when, you know, this is totally make-believe. There are a lot of limitations to natural selection and things that aren't frequently taken into account, and we kind of address that with like the penguins, and say, look at all of the non-genetic, non-heritable factors that are involved in survival. And the natural selection is only going to be able to work on heritable traits. And so since you can't pass on whether your mom got eaten by a seal or not, it's not subject to natural selection. But frequently we equate natural selection with evolution. And so if I don't believe in evolution, then I don't believe in natural selection. Well, there is evidence for natural selection in a limited way. So if we would say that there isn't, then people are going to like pull out the evidences, and we would look foolish.
Yeah, I think that we have a lot of students that, for discussion board 3 on the penguins, I think that they tend to go, they understand that things that have nothing to do with your DNA can affect your survival. But then what happens is that they say, okay, so natural selection doesn't occur at all, or natural selection equals evolution. So I wanted, that's why I suggested this argument, because I wanted this to have an explanation so students could maybe clear that in their mind, we'd clear any confusion about that natural selection does indeed occur. But I think that it's more, from what actually happens, it's much more limited than what evolutionists would say. Evolutionists would say that it can almost create things.
Right. So natural selection always works by elimination. It's always knocking stuff out. It's not creating anything new. There's no driving force to create new. The driving force is to eliminate. And I emphasize the limitations of natural selection because I'm running counter to what all the textbooks and everything say. And so I emphasize the examples that highlight the limitations, and then sometimes, it can come across that, well, natural selection can't do anything. But obviously, here's where it can, right? So you're the baby penguin. Do you have a mutation where you don't have enough feathers or you don't have enough fat layers? Well, then you're going to freeze to death. So natural selection would weed out mutations that affected their insulation. Okay, so there are examples of that, or if it had legs that couldn't work or something like that, then it's not going to be able to run away from predators.
Right.
Yep. Anything else on that, or are we good?
I think that's clear. We didn't have any questions from students, so I think we're good.
Okay. God created the world to look old or with the appearance of age. This one is interesting, but we got to consider some of the nuances here. So on the one hand, it's kind of like, did Adam have a belly button? Well, he would not have had an umbilical cord attached to a mother because God made him from the dirt. Okay? And he didn't make him as a 2-day-old baby. He made him as with some maturity. So if you saw Adam, say on day 7, he wouldn't look like he was 7 days old. He would look like maybe he was 15 or 20 years old. So on the one hand, he would appear old, but we know from Scripture that he wasn't. Okay. Now, if we're talking about that kind of appearance of age, that's one thing. But a lot of times people apply this to God planted fossils in the rocks to test our faith, or God made the layers of rocks just so that the earth would look old, or that God made supernovas, the light from supernovas in transit for us. Those are very problematic and get into and I think this is right, in such a case it would be deceptive of God to plant fossils to test our faith, to make it all look like it was old. I think partly this is folks that are trying to justify a young Earth without having to address some of the issues with radiometric dating and geologic layers and stuff like that. It's a way to just kind of brush it all aside.
I think that's exactly what it is. I know that my father has had this problem because he was a science teacher and he never grew up hearing any kind of six-day literal creation arguments. I mean, he also grew up in a different time, but he's told me that he just can't believe in a young earth creation because that would mean that God was deceptive and that he created the world to look old. Science says it's old, the world looks old, and therefore he has to choose either that God is deceptive or that maybe we're interpreting the Bible incorrectly, therefore the world must be old. So I think it's really people trying to deal with science and what science is saying and what the Bible is saying, and they don't know how to put it together, and that's what ends up happening.
Right. You know, I talked to, it was a guy from France, interestingly enough, who did a lot of mountain climbing. And so we were talking about the age of the Earth, and he said, well, he believed that the Earth was millions of years old. And when I asked him why, he said, well, the mountains just look old. They look like they're millions of years old. But then I asked him, well, what would they look like if they were thousands of years old? And he didn't have an answer because, and part of it, too, is our perception sometimes, you know, of what we expect or don't expect.
Exactly. I think that we expect something to look old because science has told us that this is 1 billion years old if it has these certain layers in it. So then we look at it and says, oh, it has the layers, it's old. So it's almost kind of a circular reasoning that we're using a wrong foundation to make an interpretation, and we don't even realize that that's why we're calling it old is because of what science has told us it should look like if it's old.
Right, and yet we have examples of canyons that are carved out in a matter of days, layers that are laid down in a matter of hours. Mount St. Helens, for example, and so, but those are not what we encounter on a daily basis, and so it does color our perception.
Exactly.
Okay. Darwin's deathbed confession of Christ. This is very old and very wrong. It was decades ago somebody started this rumor, and just like the emails that bounce around for years and years, this has been bouncing around for years and years. And I think because people want it to be true. And so they want it to be true, and so they'll pass it on to somebody else, you know. Or didn't Darwin become a Christian? Didn't he recant at his deathbed? No, he didn't. And his children affirm that. He never became a Christian. he never renounced his evolutionary views, and it's sad. Moon dust proves the young moon. This stems from the lunar landing. NASA, in sending the rockets to the moon, no one had been there before, and so one of the concerns that they had was when the lunar lander touched down, what was it going to encounter? And they anticipated a large amount of dust, and so if the rocket landed in a big pile of dust, they needed to be prepared for that. And as it turned out, there was not anywhere near as much dust as they had calculated, but it wasn't because the reason was because they miscalculated it. So they had the wrong input, so they got the wrong answer and didn't have the amount of dust that they expected. But that doesn't count as evidence for a young moon because they made a boo-boo.
I'm surprised that NASA would make such a mistake.
Well, they're human too. I mean,
I guess so.
Right. There's one famous space mistake on the space station, I think it was, where the Americans were using, one size for the bolts and stuff, and the Europeans were using the metric system, and so the stuff didn't connect.
Right.
And so sometimes there are things like that you'd go, oh, no, but people make mistakes.
True.
The plesiosaur. Yeah, there were a number of photographs of this rotting carcass of something that a Japanese fishing trawler had pulled up out of the ocean, and they took a bunch of pictures of it and dumped it back over because it stunk really bad. And so there are just these photographs of this half-rotten carcass. And when you look at the pictures, and I remember seeing the pictures back probably late 80s, early 90s, it looked like it was a plesiosaur. It looked like it was a marine reptile. And so it was kind of interesting and kind of exciting, except careful analysis of the evidence indicates that this was not a plesiosaur. It was actually a basking shark. And what people thought was the head was actually the tail. And but the pictures of this have gone around. There was must have been in Journal of Creation, where creation scientists did a very careful study of this subject and came to the conclusion of it being a basking shark, not a plesiosaur. And so this is a good example, getting back to what I was talking about at the beginning, why it's crucial to have information that's current and has been vetted and reviewed by experts. And so we can be sure when we've got this kind of review that we've got good stuff that we're using. Adam's rib legacy. This one is very interesting because when God made Eve, right? It says that he took part of the rib and made the woman. And so the expectation is that, well, men are going to have fewer ribs than women. Well, that would only really have been true of Adam. Okay, so maybe Adam was missing a rib, but it doesn't mean that his sons would be missing a rib, right? Because that actually is like Lamarckianism, where like the blacksmith has calloused hands, so his kids have calloused hands, or like the giraffe stretches his neck, and so the offspring have stretched necks, or like that. I will say, though, that I recently found that chimpanzees have an extra rib over what humans do.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. It's not, you can't use it as any kind of a proof or evidence. So I'm sad about that. But it's like, huh? That is very interesting, right? But we're supposed to have a common ancestor with them, so why don't we have the same number of ribs?
Right.
And you know, I do think that, well, we see from Romans 1, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. I firmly believe that, and I think there are some things like this that are kind of affirming in that way. You can't use it as a proof, but nonetheless, it's an interesting sign marker, in my opinion.
It is.
Yeah, or like another one is laminin, the protein laminin, which I think it's Louis Giglio has stuff where he's talking about this, because laminin has 3 strands in one protein, and it's the critical protein in the extracellular matrix holding cells together, and it has the shape of a cross. And so, to me, it's really neat, the analogies to Christ and the cross. It's neat. We can't use it as a proof or an argument or an evidence, but for the believer, I think it's a sign marker. It's an affirmation. Earth's axis was vertical before the flood. That would have been really bad, because the seasons are a result of the tilt of the Earth's axis, and so yeah, we would have had a lot of problems if that was the case. It's possible that that there was a slight shift, but it would not have been from the vertical up to 23 degrees. Genesis 10:25 refers to the splitting of continents from Pangaea. There's been a lot of investigation into this and what does it mean in Genesis 10 when it talks about the earth was divided at his time. I've heard, and I think one of the best explanations actually is that it was the time of the Tower of Babel, and it wasn't the earth itself that divided, but it's when the people groups spread out across the earth. So that one, there's still some question about what that really means. Okay, and NASA approves the Bible, Long Day of Joshua. This is one of those internet myth, because I remember seeing that when I was in grad school, early 90s. I got an email from somebody that was talking about that, and that there was like NASA calculated that there was a missing day. It's a total myth. It's a total fabrication. First Timothy 6:20, science falsely so called does not specifically relate to evolution. That verse, right? Turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge is another way that verse is used. It's what it's referring to are things that set themselves up contrary to the Word of God. And so in one sense, evolution falls into that category, but so do a lot of other things. And it's not specifically talking about evolution. Biloxi dinosaur tracks. This is referring to in Texas, the Biloxi River. They had a number of dinosaur tracks that were left in rock, and supposedly there were also human tracks that were left in the same area. I remember reading about this, would have been late 80s, early 90s. I saw pictures of it, looked really good. I've personally talked to people who said that they saw the footprints. This has been greatly controversial for decades now, and the most recent analysis from creationists about the Biloxi tracks is that some dinosaur tracks after erosion can appear to be human tracks. And so they were concluding that what looked like human tracks or came across as human tracks were not. They were eroded dinosaur tracks. Now, I've talked to some folks who say the human tracks that they saw were in a different area. They weren't those tracks. But until I see some really hard evidence to the contrary, I'm going to go with the more careful analysis that it's eroded dinosaur tracks and not human tracks at the same time. It would have been nice. It would have been nice to have dinosaur tracks and human tracks in the same layer, but I don't think we had dinosaurs and people living in the same area very much, living at the same time because of how Genesis lays out creation. We were living at the same time as dinosaurs. But after the flood, dinosaurs were probably in very low abundance, and probably people killed off the remaining dinosaurs that there were. They didn't survive well after the flood, and because they didn't have very many numbers, that's why we don't see dinosaur and human tracks together. One other thing related to this issue, in terms of fossils, it's like 90% of all fossils are marine organisms. And so dinosaurs, we make a big deal out of the dinosaurs, but there really are very few dinosaur fossils. I think number of T-Rex fossils, for example, is like 10 or less. Now, we have a bunch of them in different museums, but it's because they're casts of original material. So there really are very few dinosaur fossils and far fewer human fossils. And so we wouldn't actually expect to find human fossils and dinosaur fossils together, just because you're asking not just to find a needle in a haystack, but 2 needles in 2 haystacks. Anything else on that?
No, we don't have any questions on that.
Okay. All right, and we're at student questions.
Okay, so I have a question. Before I give you the question, if any of you have questions, please send them to me because we don't have very many. I got an email from David Taylor, but I don't really understand what your question is, so if you could write it again to me, if you can write it in the chat, then I can see if I can get it to Dr. DeWitt. Okay, so the first question is, back to Darwin on his deathbed. Was Darwin a Christian before he believed in evolution, and did he grow up in a Christian home?
Darwin's father and grandfather were known to be unbelievers. Darwin went to Cambridge and studied theology. His degree from Cambridge is in theology. Now, I am not in a position to judge really whether someone I can talk to is a Christian or not. Even more complicated, someone that has been dead for decades. But the indications are if he was a believer at all, it was very weak or nominal at best. It's like sometimes we will say someone is a cultural Christian, meaning they don't really believe it personally, they don't have a personal relationship with Christ, but because just from the culture, there are some attitudes and things that people just go along with. And so, if anything, that was where Darwin was. Now, he did write that he read Paley's Natural Theology while at Cambridge, and he initially found the argument, Paley's design argument, compelling. But so while Darwin may have had some kind of belief in a deity, it probably was along the lines of deism, and there's no indication that he had any saving knowledge of Christ. Another actually very interesting thing in his autobiography, he wrote about how much he loved shooting and killing birds. And also he wrote about how he beat a puppy for the sport of it. And
that doesn't sound good.
It's kind of creepy because it's like, this is like what we expect. This is like really antisocial behavior. This is like what the, really nasty people do. But yeah, I read that in his autobiography and I was like, oh my gosh, this is bizarre.
So we're thinking that all indications are that he got a degree in theology, but he didn't seem to have a strong faith.
Right, if at all. And there are religion professors at many state universities, and they've studied religion, but they don't believe in anything. I've known of those professors.
Okay, so let me see. Another question that we had was, can you explain again the difference between microevolution and macroevolution?
Okay, microevolution is referring to changes in gene frequency in a population of organisms over time. A good illustration for it is dog breeding. Right, we've got the different kinds of breeds, but it's all coming from an ancestral dog group. Okay. So it's changing the frequency of a trait in a population, changing the proportion that have one color over another, one beak length over another, that kind of thing. Macroevolution requires new information to get new traits. So macroevolution, you're getting birds from dinosaurs. Where'd you get the feathers? Macroevolution, you're getting wolf-like creatures that become whales. Well, where do you get the information for the baleen, for the blubber, for the fluke tail, for all this? So evolutionists want to say microevolution over a long period of time results in macroevolution, but that's not going to work because all you're doing with natural selection is weeding out and eliminating. You're not making new. You have to have a source for the new genetic information, and that's what's missing.
Okay, we have one more question. Can you explain the difference between the different dating methods, helium, uranium, and carbon, and how do we know, what are the differences in how each of those, the weight given to each of those and their validity?
Oh, wow. Read that one again.
I'm paraphrasing. So can you explain the difference in dating using like carbon or uranium or helium? And how do we know which of these are valid dating methods?
Okay. Uranium and carbon, that is radiometric. So what scientists are measuring is the ratio of one form of carbon versus another, so carbon-14 versus carbon-12. Or in the case of uranium, they're measuring the number of uranium atoms versus the number of lead atoms, or potassium versus the number of argon. And in those cases, okay, scientists can measure with great accuracy the number of atoms that are present. Okay, so they're using frequently a mass spectrometer or different chemical analysis to quantify the atoms, and they are very accurate. Okay, but that instrument is not a clock. It's not measuring time. It's measuring the quantity of atoms of one type or another. There are assumptions that you can infer a rate in the passage of time by the rate of radioactive decay, but you're making a lot of assumptions to do that. In the case of helium, they are measuring a rate of diffusion of helium out of a crystal. Helium is a slippery gas, and it will leach out of rock or out of crystal. And so scientists can measure with great accuracy the amount of helium that is in a crystal, or based on the amount of uranium and lead in the crystal, how much helium would be expected in the crystal. So that's a different type of method. In terms of the reliability of both of those, the reliability is not a problem in terms of how many atoms do I have. I can have great confidence that that number is correct. Where I have less confidence is when I apply assumptions to make the number of atoms equal a clock.
So really the problem is more with the assumptions and what the worldview is behind it.
Right. So the accuracy of the measurements, impeccable. But the interpretation of what the measurement means, because in all of the cases there are unprovable assumptions that are being made, then I would have less confidence in that as a clock.
Okay, that makes sense. So, well, kind of related to this question, we have another question. The video from the rate team at ICR stated there should not be carbon-14 in diamonds if the Earth is as old as evolutionists claim, because it would have been depleted due to the amount of time. So how do evolutionists then explain the fact that diamonds actually do have carbon-14?
That's a very interesting subject. Okay, so the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,600 years. Okay, so they're using instruments that will measure the amount of carbon-14 in a sample. Okay, but any analysis, there's a detection threshold. So below a certain number, I can't detect it. Okay, so there's really not a lot of carbon-14 anywhere. Okay, but if it depletes half every 5,000 years, when I get to 90,000 years, I would have the remaining C14 would be undetectable. It would be below the detection threshold of the instrument. Okay? So yeah, the rate team found, well, first they found C14 in coal, which was exciting, but amplified by finding C14 in the diamonds, which are, both of these are supposed to be 300 million years old. It's way past where there should be any detectable carbon, but they had detectable carbon. I know that secular scientists tried to replicate the experiment, and when they did, they found carbon-14. They found data consistent with what the rate team reported. But what they were saying was, well, it's just contamination. Well, okay, if it's contamination, then how do I know I don't have contamination on any sample? Like if I can't if I can't trust that, then like how do I know what any of the things are good?
If it's contamination, how can we trust their results ever?
Right. So it's contamination when the results don't match what you expect.
Exactly.
So then, yeah, why would I trust it? One thing along these lines, too, there have been just a few reports of dinosaur fossils that have been dated for C14, and along these same lines, there should be no C14 in a dinosaur fossil, okay? But when scientists have looked, they have found it. My predecessors at Liberty University Center for Creation Studies had an Allosaurus that they sent for carbon dating. And I have the report that they got from University of Arizona on the C14 and the age range was 14,000 to 18,000 years. That's more than the 6,000, obviously.
Right.
But I wouldn't want to have to explain the 65 million year thing with C4. But it's just a little off. And with all the, I don't have a problem with it. Okay, it's still 6,000 years old, but 18 is good enough for me. What's interesting is when others have done the C14 of dinosaurs, they've gotten from other specimens, they've gotten results in the same time frame, which you would only expect if it really was kind of legit. And so
right.
it would be hard to have the same amount of contamination in different parts of the different fossils in different parts of the world. We wouldn't
right.
really expect that kind of consistency.
Right.
So, this has really been squashed. And I saw a video. People were going to pay Jack Horner to do C14 analysis of the soft tissue that Mary Schweitzer discovered, and they refused to do it.
Wow.
They refused to then say, this is like almost 10 years ago, okay? They refused to analyze that for C14. Now,
well, if you can't explain it by contamination, better just to avoid the question altogether.
Right. So they evolutionists will not carbon date a dinosaur. I personally, I think they probably have. I think they have. They know the answer, and they don't want to give it.
Right.
So it would be too easy, right? If they're sure that they're right, carbon date the dang thing, and shut me up.
Right. Well, you can't control the argument that way.
Right.
Okay, we have a couple more questions that have come in. The first one is it possible that a majority of the fossils are missing due to the catastrophic plate tectonic, as mentioned by Dr. John Baumgartner?
Yeah, it's likely, and there's probably a lot of fossils that are underwater in the ocean.
So you think yes?
Yes.
Okay. The next question is, will you please explain junk DNA?
Junk DNA is not junk. Out of the 3 billion nucleotides, it's like something like 2% that code for proteins. And so evolutionists said that the rest was junk. It was evolutionary baggage. Well, we're finding it's not. A lot of it's regulatory, a lot of it's structural. We're finding codes on top of codes. And I have a video on that subject at Answers in Genesis website. Junk DNA is not junk is the title of it. I go into a lot of detail on that.
Okay. I have another question. I'm not exactly sure. I think what they mean. It says, can you expound on the seemingly overriding influence of pride in the theory of evolution? I think that for some students it can be frustrating when the answers to questions are things like they don't even want to do the test because they don't want to have to admit they might be wrong, or I think that can be frustrating for some people because it seems like the argument is one-sided.
Right. But see, we have to remember the heart is desperately wicked above all things. Who can know it? And evolution allows people to avoid the reality of their sinful condition and need for a savior. And so you'll see this from atheists. They don't want there to be a God because they don't want to be accountable. And it's plain and simple.
I think it's true not just of evolutionists. I think it's true of people.
Right. It's intrinsic to our human nature.
Exactly. Okay, I have a question. In the Bill Nye debate, one issue I don't feel Ken Ham addressed well was the ice core column and how many rings would have had to form per year. How would you respond to this?
Oh, Answers in Genesis has a more thorough explanation about the ice cores on their website.
We can send that, if you want, we can find the article and send it to the students that asked the question.
Yeah, and see, what they're doing with the ice cores too, they're trying to measure the amount of oxygen 18 in a layer of compressed ice, and I don't have any confidence that any of that ice core stuff has any validity.
Okay, I think I found the article. Jeremy, I'll send you the link for it. I'll email it to you. Actually, Jeremy, can you send me an email? I'm gonna give you my email address here. That way it'll be easier for me to find you. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I think that we're gonna close out the session. If students think of any other questions later, you can always email me. My email is on the original email for the registration for the event. My email is kjstanfo@liberty.edu. So you can send me your questions, and either I can answer it, we can forward it to your professor, or Dr. DeWitt can get back to you about it. So Dr. DeWitt, thank you for coming tonight and being available to do this webinar with us. I think that's going to be valuable, not just for those of us that came tonight, but for the other students that will be able to hear it later on.
Okay. It's good to be with you guys.